Senator Coyle.
Honourable colleagues, hopefully, after today, we will all be able to stop crying over spilled milk. The 30 million litres of spilled Canadian milk we are upset about were dumped due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the related problems in balancing supply and demand in our dairy sector. Today, the Senate of Canada is sitting to consider Bill C-16, an act to amend the Canadian Dairy Commission Act so that Canada's dairy farmers won't need to spill any more milk, and so that they and all Canadians can stop shedding our tears over this terrible and regrettable travesty. The Canadian dairy industry, as we've heard from our colleague Senator Rob Black, is very important to our food security and nutritional status, as well as being a significant contributor to our economy, especially in rural Canada, as my colleague Senator Carignan has just pointed out. In Canada, we have over 10,000 dairy farms with 1.4 million dairy cows. There are 514 dairy processors, and the dairy sector sustains approximately 220,000 full-time equivalent jobs for Canadians. The sector contributes $20 billion towards Canada's GDP and $3.8 billion in annual tax revenue. This is significant. Before this recent COVID-related spilled milk crisis, this vital Canadian dairy sector was already undergoing another crisis, brought on as a result of 3 recent international trade agreements: CETA with Europe, CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific region, and the recent CUSMA with the US and Mexico. At full implementation of these agreements, market access granted to others will represent 18% of the Canadian market, resulting in Canadian dairy producers losing $328 million annually, $154 million of that due to CUSMA alone. In addition to the market access concessions, CUSMA imposes export market caps on worldwide shipments, not just those to the US, by the way, of certain Canadian dairy products. With CUSMA coming into effect July 1st rather than August 1st of this year, the negative impact will be greater and accelerate faster. These export market caps will ultimately result in significant annual losses for dairy producers as well. So to be clear, what we are here to examine today is a measure designed to respond to the negative impacts of the COVID crisis on a sector which is already feeling bruised. The 3 previous emergency response bills that we have considered here were designed to address the needs of those Canadians left vulnerable due to the negative impacts of the COVID pandemic. The first created income support payments, the CERB, for people who could no longer work due to COVID. The second created wage subsidies, the CEWS, for businesses and nonprofits which had lost significant income due to COVID, so they could pay their workers and keep them ready to recommence work. The third COVID emergency response bill, the CESB, will provide income support for students who can't find work this summer. Applications for that program are being received as of today. So due to the COVID pandemic, we are discovering, taking note of, and trying to address vulnerabilities across many aspects of our Canadian society and our economy. Since the creation of the Canadian Dairy Commission and the introduction of the supply management system by the Canadian dairy sector in the 1970s, this has been a very reliably managed sector for both the producers and for us consumers. However, with COVID, this well-oiled machine has developed vulnerabilities we would have never expected. With the COVID pandemic, one of the main public health measures has been social distancing, which in turn led to the shutdown of the restaurant sector, as well as many other institutions such as schools and universities. That shutdown resulted in reduced demand for dairy products, including cheese and cream, thus causing the bottlenecks in the supply chain that led to the unfortunate dumping, the spilling of that milk. The Canadian Dairy Commission is a Canadian Crown corporation. Its objectives are to provide producers of milk and cream with the opportunity to obtain a fair return for their labor and investment, and to provide consumers with a continuous and adequate supply of high-quality dairy products. The CDC is therefore well-placed to assist the dairy sector with its COVID-related oversupply problems. Bill C-16 is in fact a response to a request by the dairy sector to have the CDC augment its purchase and storage programs in order to help the industry balance supply and demand variations, which were no longer predictable due to the COVID-19 related impacts on consumer behavior. In essence, Bill C-16 amends the Canadian Dairy Commission Act and increases its borrowing capacity by $200 million to $500 million. The CDC, in turn, will be able to purchase and store more cheese and butter from dairy processors, which they can then buy back later when market demand warrants it. This measure, which will provide the CDC with sufficient borrowing capacity now and well into the future, provides relief to dairy producers and processors and reduces further waste, hopefully no more spilled milk. Colleagues, this is very good news for the sector and for all Canadians. Fortunately, the dairy farmers themselves have generously found a way to donate some of their surplus milk to food banks, and hopefully the government's recently announced $50 million surplus food purchase program, part of the $252 million initial funding package for the agriculture and food sector, might allow for purchase and redistribution of any further excess milk. I live in a very rural area of northeastern Nova Scotia, where we have many well-run dairy operations. Some are run by the Dutch families who came to our area after the Second World War. When studying this bill, we reached out to Chris Vanden Heuvel, an Inverness County dairy farmer, past president of Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture, and currently second vice president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. Chris Vanden Heuvel said to us, "These are trying times. Within dairy, we've been hit despite our supply management system. The loss of the food services side of the sector has meant the dumping of upwards of 1 million litres of milk a week. With 2 monthly declines in our quota, which means less milk to ship, it of course limits our income. All of this has added to the mental health stress of our dairy farmers, who are already in an industry with razor-thin margins. Added to this is an animal welfare issue, with farmers having to make decisions to either dry cows off early or cull them all together. Not a good situation all around, but keep in mind that other sectors, and this is Chris saying this, horticulture, beef, pork, chicken, equine, seafood farming, mushrooms, ornamentals, to name a few, are hurting just as bad. Brian Cameron, General Manager of Dairy Farmers of Nova Scotia, responded to our communications by saying, and I quote, "Dairy farmers welcomed the announcement of the federal support for the agriculture sector. Dairy farmers across the country are working hard to help feed Canadians in a time of great uncertainty, and we welcome measures that will stabilize our sector. The large quota reductions in April and May at a time when milk production typically increases directly reduces cash flow at an expensive time of the year with spring field preparation and planting happening. I believe, in speaking with many producers, and this is Chris saying this, that the tragic events earlier in April here in Nova Scotia, along with the social distancing and other restrictions, are taking their toll mentally as well as socially. The bad news that the government gave away the August 1st CUSMA start date further harms dairy farmers. We've been let down too many times. Despite these setbacks, Brian says, our producers are strong and resilient and will produce high-quality milk. Colleagues, Canadian dairy farmers may be strong and resilient, as Mr. Cameron described them, but I know that it broke their hearts and their spirits for them to have to dispose of the precious milk that they and their cows worked so hard to produce. Colleagues, let's not let these farmers down. Let's pass Bill C-16, and let's all think of these hard-working dairy farmers when we enjoy our milkshakes, our frappuccinos, and our ice cream cones with our families this summer. Merci, Walaleo. Thank you.